Hello, my name is Agata Paszke and I am a graduate student of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It is my utmost pleasure to present to you this series of interviews with Professor Michael Devitt, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Over the years, Professor Devitt has published numerous books and articles, most notably on issues in philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of biology. These interviews, conducted during Professor Devitt's visit to Krakow in November 2024, center around three topics. The first one concerns Professor Devitt's philosophical development and the origins of his ideas, beginning with some early reflections from the time preceding his post-secondary education, for undergraduate and graduate training, all the way to the early period of his career which followed the completion of his PhD studies at Harvard University. The second topic concerns realism and naturalism, two guiding principles not just of Professor Devitt's metaphysics, but of the entirety of his philosophical thought. Issues concerning language, broadly construed, constitute the third topic. By discussing some of these key themes from Professor Devitt's philosophy, we strove to connect his ideas regarding many philosophical problems, often seemingly far removed from one another, whilst also acknowledging the crucial changes which occurred between his subsequent theoretical proposals. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Enjoy. You have been arguing for realism tirelessly throughout all these years. Well, however, one could argue that there are as many realisms as there are realists. So let's start with the following question. What is realism?
Right. Yes, it's a baffling subject, realism, because there are so many doctrines jostling for attention under the term realism, and this makes it a very confusing a very confusing subject to talk about. What is the subject exactly? What is the doctrine? So my line on this, and by the way, we're talking here of realism about, as it used to be called, realism about the external world, because you can have realism about morals or modality or whatever. We're just talking of realism about both the observable world and also the unobservable world. That's where you get scientific realism, and I want to argue for both. So I put my realism in a fairly straightforward way. I want to say that the tokens of various common sense, physical, common sense, observable, so-called observable objects. There are such things, and there are such unobservable objects of the sort posited by science and by common sense, the observable ones. There are such objects. This is what I call the existence dimension, and they exist and have their nature in important respects independent of human minds. So they're not mental, as Berkeley thought. They're not constituted by our concepts in any way, as Kant said. They're independent. They don't depend for their nature and existence on our languages, our cultures, our genders, or anything else. They exist out there independent of us. That's the sort of realism I think needs to be defended.
Right, so it encompasses these two dimensions, right? The independence dimension and the existence dimension.
And the sort of things we're talking about, very humdrum objects when we're talking of the common sense ones, stones, trees, cats, and then we get to the unobservables, and so we get viruses and electrons, atoms, and so on.
Right.
I like viruses, though.
You like them?
Well, I like them as an example.
Okay.
Because, well, people can be a bit dubious about fancy things like electrons, which are so fundamental to science. But viruses are actually so much part of our lives and an absolute We've, after all, just been through an awful problem with the virus. And so it's a very interesting idea that they don't exist.
Well, they do, as we have all seen and experienced.
Right. So those are the sorts of things, the existence of which I really want to defend, yes. And the independent existence of them, yes.
Right. So let's focus on your issue with anti-realism. In Putting Metaphysics First, you famously wrote that religion is not just a hazard of philosophy, but a hazard of life. If we could explain religion, I think that we could explain anti-realism. So that quote really links up these two things quite close. So why is a rejection of realism in favor of anti-realism an occupational hazard, and perhaps also maybe a hazard of life?
Well, I don't think it's a hazard of life, but I do think it's a hazard of philosophy, and it's certainly interesting to figure out why. I mean, why? Going back to the previous interview where you quoted John Heil, why was it in the 70s and 80s that the anti-realist tracks, as he nicely put it, are everywhere, and there is just a small batch of realist tracks? How come it's so common? World making became a sort of relativistic Kantianism, became what I have referred to as the metaphysics of the 20th century. So how did this come about? It's not, of course, the sort of view of ordinary folk. It's a view of intellectuals, not just philosophers. How did it come about? Well, it's I sum it up in two unfortunate turns in philosophy. First, the epistemological turn in modern philosophy, starting with Descartes, and the linguistic turn in the 20th century. And so perhaps I should say a bit about the modern philosophy. And to my eye, this all starts in this wonderful first meditation of Descartes, so vivid and so personal. He's sitting by the fire and he has all his beliefs about the external world, and he sets about rejecting them all. He's going to reject anything he doesn't clearly and distinctly see to be true. And he sets on this path of rejecting by some very ingenious and very telling arguments. Surely he thinks we can rely on, we can be confident about the existence of all these things because our senses tell us about this. But then he points out, but surely our senses can deceive us. And he has a bit to say about that. And then perhaps I'm dreaming. We've all had the experience of dreaming, and when you dream, you think all sorts of things, but in fact, they're not true. And then finally, there's the real masterstroke of maybe there's an evil demon or evil spirit, which is making us think all these things, even though they're all what we think is false. And in modern terms, the evil demon has been replaced with the brain in the vat fantasy. Maybe you're nothing but a brain in a vat, stimulated by some crazed scientist so that you experience the world just as if, you have experiences just as you now have of a world, but there isn't any world. All there is out there is whatever is stimulating you, that's all. So this is the sort of beginning of the way down a bad path, it seems to me. A key thing to notice about it is that it starts off with an epistemological view. How could you know this? How could you know that? That's what Descartes is asking. And he comes up with answers you couldn't know for all these sorts of reasons. And how are you going to solve this problem? Well, Descartes solved it by appealing to God. To modern eyes, a very implausible thesis. That is, he urged that God was no deceiver, and since Descartes believed in all this external world, then it must be so because God would otherwise be deceiving him. A very unconvincing argument. But what you see with Descartes Descartes, in other words, saved realism, but only with the help of something of God in a very implausible way. Most people faced with this sort of skeptical issue have favored anti-realism, and that's how we get into this problem. There's a sort of form of argument here. You start with an epistemological thesis about how you can and can't know, and then the move to anti-realism comes. Given this epistemological thesis, you could not know about this external world independent of our minds. So you don't know about this world. There is no such world. And so then if you want to save the world, you have to make the world, bring it in some way into the mind, putting that very loosely. That seems to me the form of the argument. If a certain epistemological thesis is true, then we couldn't know the realist world. We couldn't know the realist world. The epistemological thesis is taken to be true, so we end up with an anti-realist worldview. And you see this sort of argument playing a role all the way through. It's made even more vivid by something which was, I think, pretty implicit in Descartes, but I'm no scholar. It certainly became explicit later on, what is known as the movie show model of the mind. Again, a bit of epistemology. What you immediately and directly perceive are ideas in your own mind. As if, this is just a way of sort of getting a feel for the idea, and hence the description, movie show model. It's as if there is a movie going on in your head, and where all your ideas show up, and what you perceive, it's as if you're a little homunculus sitting in the movie show, and you're looking at the screen. And that's your ideas, and this is what you directly perceive. And so then the question of realism comes up in this form. Is there anything outside the mind, outside this movie show, causing and resembling what I see on the screen? Those two key ideas. Realism is the view, yes, there is something outside the mind causing and resembling the inner show. Once you head down that path, the movie show model, with that picture of what it is to be realist, the game is almost over for realism. Locke, what a wonderful philosopher Locke was, he, faced with this, managed to preserve realism to his satisfaction by basically arguing that there was something out there causing and resembling the inner show. But wonderful philosopher that Locke was, this was terribly unconvincing, and Berkeley pointed this out dramatically and just conclusively. There was really no argument here for this outside external world, and so Berkeley, of course, dramatically brought the external world out of the external and made it internal. Indeed, going back to that form of argument, Berkeley vividly remarked that realism, or he didn't call it realism, of course, he called it materialism, but the doctrine I'm calling realism, he said this was the root of skepticism. Yeah. That is, Berkeley thought if you believed in realism, then you couldn't know anything about the external world. So we mustn't believe in this because we do know about the external world. And that's back to that form of argument. And of course, you had a similar sort of thing going on with Hume. And then, of course, the most serious figure here, damaging figure of all, was Kant. Because Kant didn't straightforwardly bring the mind, bring the world into the mind as Berkeley did. I mean, the great advantage of Berkeley's view for a realist point of view is no one could believe that. But Kant had a more obscure view, which seems to be very, very influential. According to Kant, of course, the world of stones and trees and cats and so on is partly our own construction. The world we know is our construction, or partly our construction. We impose our categories on the world, on the independent world, because he thought, after all, there was an independent world, the noumenal world. But we couldn't know anything about the noumenal world. There was the phenomenal world, which was the world we knew as a result, and that's the known world. That's the world of stones and trees and cats, and that was as a result of the imposition of concepts. This is a dramatically influential view. Indeed, I regard it as the greatest bad idea in the history of philosophy, because it's great, because it's really so encompassing, and it became so popular. Kantianism was part of the metaphysics of the 20th century. As I was remarking before, what was added in the 20th century was relativism to the Kantian thing. So these key ideas, the known world is partly our construction, and the independent world, the noumenal world, is beyond our ken. These are terribly influential ideas. You find it also, for example, in Kuhn, you find it in the postmodernist, you find it in Benjamin Lee Whorf, Putnam, Goodman. It's everywhere.
Right, and you...
that's the modern, I've only talked about the linguistic turn arising from the epistemological thing. What I want to say in response to it is, well, look at where it's all coming from. An epistemological thesis, a thesis about what we can know and how we can know it and what we can't know. Where did all that knowledge come from? Where did our epistemology come from? And here's where I bring in the naturalism I got from Quine. This is just a priori epistemology. This is not an epistemology based on this is not an epistemology that is empirically based. And from a naturalistic perspective, everything we claim to know has to be empirically based. That is, it has to be established using our ordinary epistemic standards. And what's going on here is the reverse of the way we should be proceeding. We should be using our epistemic standards to find out. They have already presented us with a picture of the world which includes snakes and trees and cats and viruses and atoms and so on. All of that is part of the worldview we get using our epistemic standards. And we also can apply these same standards to come up with a theory of how we know about. How do we know about? We've just said we do know about them because that's part of our thing, but how do we know? What are the mechanisms of knowledge? Well, that's an empirical issue too. And we have to apply the same epistemic standards to arrive at that. That's all, it seems to me, the problem in modern philosophy, the epistemological turn. It started in the wrong place. A priori epistemology led to an a priori, usually anti-realist metaphysics. what we need to do is turn it around. We start with an empirical metaphysics based on science and sort of common sense. And from that empirical basis, empirical metaphysics, we then develop an empirical epistemology, a naturalized epistemology. That seemed to me the way to go. In the 20th century, of course, the epistemological turn was replaced by what you might call the linguistic turn. And now, instead of starting from but it's a very related move, instead of starting with an epistemology and deriving an a priori epistemology and deriving an a priori metaphysics, in the 20th century, people started with an a priori semantics and somehow derived an anti-metaphysical thing, an anti-metaphysical metaphysics. Sorry, an anti-realist metaphysics. So again, the direction is all wrong. We should start with our empirical metaphysics, then work on our semantics, and we should come up with an empirically based semantics against the background of the empirical established metaphysics. And this is what I'm getting at with putting a metaphysics first. We should do the metaphysics before we do the epistemology, before we do the semantics. And if we do that, realism is really not in question, it seems to me. There's a sort of image you get, which is vividly brought out with the movie show model. Here you are, as it were, imprisoned in your mind, and you're trying to think, what's out there? And how could we know about something out there? That was the modern epistemological term. That was the problem that they faced, which nearly always led to anti-realism. And in the 20th century, it's here we are in our mind. How can we refer to anything out there? How can we get out of our mind and reach out and get there? It's impossible. Putnam had when Putnam went anti-realist, he had this vivid phrase for this. The realist who supposes you can do this must have a God's eye view. Yeah. We are really imprisoned in our minds, and we can't figure out, there's no way we can get outside our skin and latch our thoughts onto reality. That's all a myth, said Putnam and people like him. Well, all of this is just the reverse of the direction. We're not imprisoned in our minds. That's in thinking about the world. This is a totally mistaken way of putting it. We start with the metaphysics, and then we try and figure out how, given this metaphysics, we know about this world, and how do we refer about this world. And of course, we know much more about the world of stones, trees, cats, atoms, and viruses, much more about that than we know about how we know about it, epistemology, or how we refer to it. Epistemology and semantics is way behind biology and physics and chemistry. Going to Quine, the vivid metaphor that Quine gave us of being of Neurath's boat. Well, obviously Neurath gave it to us first, but Quine made it famous. Our task from a naturalistic perspective is to rebuild the boat while staying afloat on it. Not just rebuild it, but develop the boat, build it bigger while staying afloat on it. That's the key thing. You can't ever get off it. And so here you are on the boat, and you've got to figure out how to build more. Well, however you do this, you're always standing on bits you've already established. And so you should stand on the bits that are the most established. You stand on the best planks on your boat. And the best planks on your boat are not epistemology and semantics, because these are things we know very little about. So you stand on the planks of your scientific knowledge of snakes, and stones, and trees, and cats, and viruses, and atoms. And against this background, you try to add to your Neurath's boat a good semantics and a good epistemology. A very difficult job. That seems to me, and this is where my naturalism comes in, So my whole approach to realism is very much tied in with the Quinean naturalism.
So would you agree that there's a noticeable tension here? On the one hand, for instance, the linguistic turn and the epistemological turn, they both threaten us with threaten you, according to, with anti-realistic sort of sentiments. Yeah. On the other hand, one can argue, and even loss of reference, as you say, and you wrote somewhere once that loss of reference threatens loss of the world, something like that. You said it in one of your books. And I wonder if you would agree that, okay, on the one hand, it threatens loss of reference, but on the other hand, it draws our attention to language.
Right.
And, well, reference is a semantic phenomenon.
Yes.
So that attention is very much needed. So it's very interesting how to kind of try to find a right way to perhaps account for these two opposite sides, opposite consequences of the linguistic turn, for instance.
I might have to get you to say a little bit more because I'm not sure I followed you there, but let me just say something about the threat. It can be put very simply. Suppose F is some predicate out of our science. Then we can say, I'm just thinking carefully, I don't want to screw this up. F exists if and only if, F's exist if and only if F refers. That's putting it. So if you establish that F doesn't refer, then you have to conclude that F doesn't exist. See, you've got a biconditional here. F exists if and only if F refers, or F's exist. And if you, obviously then the threat comes, if you conclude there is no reference, that F doesn't refer, then you've got to conclude that F doesn't exist. It's a sort of very boring sort of truth. But of course, then if there's the threat, and oversimplifying, but in, I hope, a helpful way, the linguistic turn argues against the existence of F's by arguing that F doesn't refer. Mm-hmm. Whereas I'm saying, from a naturalistic perspective and resisting the linguistic turn, we should first of all argue for F exists. And given that, then we have established that F refers.
Right.
So that's the threat, but you'll have to say again what you want asking me, because I didn't quite follow it.
No, I was asking about the sort of focus on language, on all different phenomena associated with language, which of course grew to a great extent with the linguistic turn in philosophy. So it's quite interesting to argue that, well, maybe it was sort of a death blow to all those semantic phenomena, because as you said, well, what's at stake is our sort of is the world, basically.
So, I mean, you're perhaps suggesting here that a good thing, and something that I should regard as good, given my enthusiasm for studying language, a good thing of the linguistic turn is that it focused attention on language. But in a way, I don't think it was a good thing, because the attention it focused on language was not a good focus. It wasn't a developing empirical theories of reference or syntax or anything. It was rather a priori sort of semantics. I mean, if you think of the sort of semantics that was going on in so-called conceptual analysis, it's not something we should approve of, it seems to me. So, and I don't know that I'm not much of a historian, and so I don't want to be too confident. I rather doubt that the linguistic turn had any good effect on the actual serious scientific theorizing about language. That's what I doubt. Though it did certainly lead to a lot of attention to language, a lot of attention to concepts. But there's concepts, which of course are semantic entities, but they're, going back to what I said about language and the Norras boat, we know so little about semantics, and I was thinking particularly then of the semantics of language, but it's true also of the semantics of the mind, that is, of our mental states. And it's it's preposterous in a way. The whole idea of conceptual analysis, insofar as it is focusing on the idea that we can use our knowledge of concepts to figure out what the world is like. We have almost no knowledge of concepts. And that's the sad truth. It's just very hard to find out much about concepts.
So let's zone in on your motivation for arguing in favor of realism. You said, and putting metaphysics first, that the case of realism partly rests on rejecting alternatives. It seems then that you're following a negative methodology here. Why is that so? And is there any positive argument for realism, really?
Yes, an interesting question. When it comes to realism about the observable world, it does seem to me that it's sort of, as it were, so prima facie and obviously initially true, plausible and so on, that it becomes an issue only when people start arguing against it, anti-realism. And that was certainly the case for me. As I was describing my intellectual background here, I was surrounded at Sydney by people who just took realism for granted. Similarly, at Harvard, and I took it for granted. There was never a moment in my life when I wasn't a realist, but I didn't argue about it because it seemed to me just part of the background assumptions from which one did interesting things like argue for theories of reference and things like that, which are much more problematic. And so I wouldn't have argued for sort of real, let's call it as I do, common sense realism, that is for about the observed world. I wouldn't have argued for it because it's just a background assumption. And I think that's common for realists. They don't think this needs an argument. It's so obviously true, so much part of our background theory that we just take it for granted. And we only address it, we only try to rebut arguments against it, like the ones that come out of the epistemological turn and the linguistic turn. But still, and I take your question, well, okay, so you have all these rejections of the anti-realists, but what actually have you got to say in favor of this realism? And I would like to approach that argument, that question, by moving to the unobservables. Because though realism about the observable world just seems a common sense and sort of, at least until you're presented with philosophical arguments, indubitable and not something we should question, realism about the unobservable world is a different matter. And that has always seemed a bit controversial. And I think quite reasonably, because here we are supposing to exist things that we can't feel and see and smell and so on, which is, it seems like quite an epistemic leap to think we can know about these things. So we get to the issue of scientific realism, which is that there are these unobservables existing independently of us. So I would like to address your question by focusing on that and then coming back to the issue of observables. The issue of scientific realism, which, as I've said, I take to be the issue of the independent existence of unobservables, has been a very lively issue in the philosophy of science, and has been and is. And the most famous argument for realism here is what has become known as the no miracles argument. And the argument runs roughly like this. Science is successful in the following sense. The observable, what scientific theories lead, the ones that posit unobservables, lead to true predictions, for the most part. And that's the respect in which they're successful. They're predictively successful at the observable level. How is this to be explained? The realist says it's to be explained by supposing that the entities, these unobservable entities that are posited by these sciences, really exist and are the way the science says they are. How do you explain all the phenomena of all the predictions you get and all the phenomena of predictions that a theory of a virus gives you? A theory that there is a virus with certain properties, for example, COVID. How do you explain all this? Well, you've got a theory that posits a virus. And the virus, if it exists and has the properties the theory says it has, that explains all these observable things. How people behave, how they get sick, the way they are, and so on. This success of the theory of the non-observable at the observational level, this predictive success, it can be explained, it is explained by supposing the theory is true. There really are viruses. They really have this. That's how we explain the success of the theory. That's the most popular answer, and it's called the no miracles argument because sometimes it's put like this. The success of our theories, positing unobservables, would be a miracle if they weren't true, if the world really wasn't the way they say it is. So that's the most popular argument. But there is another argument for realism which is much less popular and has been largely neglected. It was proposed by several people around 1984. My favorite, I proposed it, but my favorite person proposing it was Ernest Macmillan, but you'll also find it in one or two other places around 1984. And this argument is a little bit different from the no miracles argument, and the difference proves, it seems to me, to be quite significant. Whereas the no miracles argument, put briefly, claims that realism explains the success of scientific theories. The alternative argument, which I called the basic argument in my Realism and Truth book, the alternative says that realism is true because it explains the observable phenomenon. It's not that it explains. We've got all the observable phenomena. For example, the observable phenomena associated with a virus. How do we explain this? Well, we explain it. The theory explains it by supposing that there is an unobservable virus. The theory that explains a lot of other things supposes there are unobservable atoms. These theories provide often the only explanation we've got of the observable phenomena. And the best explanation. Well, that's why we should believe in them. We should believe in them because we should have a realist view of our theories, because the theories taken realistically explain the phenomena. So it can seem a little hard to detach this and distinguish this from the no miracles argument. I know, because I was rather, I didn't make as much of the difference between this argument, this basic argument, and the no miracles argument myself until quite recently. But it is different. You're not explaining the success of theories, the observational success of theories. Realism is explaining the observed phenomena. So that's how I would argue and have argued for scientific realism. And that's the model. If you press and say, well, how would you argue for realism about the observables? Something that, as I've said already, I think it's almost unnecessary to argue for it, because it sort of seems sort of obviously true until you get faced with these anti-realist arguments. How would you argue? Well, you'd argue for it on the same sort of model as the argument for scientific realism. It's just a somewhat unnatural argument here. And the reason it's unnatural is, with the argument for scientific realism, you've got something very clearly identifiable and independently identifiable that needs to be explained. What? The observed phenomena. And suppose we're talking, trying to be realist about viruses. The observed phenomena are all the symptoms, what are thought to be the symptoms of the virus. How do you explain them? And then you posit you posit this unobserved entity, virus. That's very neat. But when you move to stones and trees and cats and things, what is it you're trying to explain when you posit a stone or a tree or a cat? Well, way back in the old days, in the modern philosophy with the epistemological turn, what you had to explain, they thought, with the movie show model, was why the movie is like that. So you've got ideas in the mind, you've got to explain that. But if we've rejected the movie show model as we can, what is it we're trying to explain by positing stones and trees and cats? Well, intuitively you want to say, as it were, perhaps inspired by that movie show model, without going with the movie show model, we need to explain, you feel like saying, our experiences. Yes, I think that's right. And that was the underlying truth of the movie show model. But then we haven't got any way of identifying our experiences that is independent of the observed world that we're trying to justify, be realist about. And that's a big difference with the scientific situation. I mean, so we have to say something like this. Well, how do you explain why it seems to us that there is a black raven on the lawn? How do you explain why it's experientially as if there is a black raven on the lawn? Notice what needs to be explained is already using the language of the realist. And the answer is because there really is a black raven on the lawn. It just doesn't have the intellectually satisfying feel to it that the argument for scientific realism has, where you can give a description of the symptoms of a virus and the virus is then supposed to explain it. Here, the very language of the symptoms, as it were, is built into, the very language of what you're being realist about is built into the symptoms you're trying to explain. You have to say, we have no way of identifying the experience except as an experience of ravens on lawns and so on. But that's basically the idea. Realism explains the way the world seems. And it perhaps isn't terribly intellectually satisfying. That's because this is hardly something, it seems to me, that we need to argue for, because it's part of our fundamental world view.
So I want to go back to the no miracles argument. Do I understand you correctly that the worry there is that we can account for the predictive success of a given theory, but we cannot explain the phenomena?
Look, I didn't actually say anything about any problem for the no miracles argument. I think there is a problem, but I just didn't say anything about it because it's really quite a difficult issue. I mean, I've written an article, in fact, which is called an ignored argument for scientific realism, which, interestingly enough, was published in the Polish journal Filozofia Nauki. And in that article, for the first time, I criticized the no miracles argument. Not for the first time, I distinguished the no miracles argument from the basic argument. I've been doing that ever since the first edition of Realism and Truth. But I had previously to this article endorsed both the no miracles argument and the basic argument. But in that article, I do see something wrong with the no miracles argument. But it's not terribly easy to explain this briefly. I mean, I haven't yet said anything about it. Do you want me to try and say something about it?
Sure. I was just wondering if perhaps there may be complementary. One concerns the observational success of a theory, the other of the observed phenomena.
Yes, they are in a sense complementary. Well, that's what I always thought. But then, look, there's a real worry about the no miracles argument, which I try to develop in that ignored argument paper. This is the worry. Early on with the no miracles argument, critics pointed something out. The most famous critic was Larry Loudon, and he pointed out, look, lots of theories in the past have been successful, which we now think weren't true at all. So their success was not explained by their truth. And realists have come back with all sorts of responses to this, which many of them interesting and many of them persuasive up to a point. But it still seems to be the case that there are clear examples which can't be explained away of theories that really were successful, and the explanation of their success is not their truth. So the critic of the no miracles argument is entitled to say, so why should we not suppose that our present theories are like this? You, realist, you are already conceded that some theories that are not true are successful. Well, how do you know that they're all not like this? Here are some alternative positions. The totally anti-realist one, all theories are, that are all successful theories are not, the success of all theories is not to be explained by their truth. The success of a few theories is to be explained by their truth. Many theories seem to be explained. Where's your basis for your claim that, which is central to the realist one, that the success of most theories, in fact, nearly all theories, is to be explained by their truth? Where did that come from? Why aren't these other alternatives just as plausible? And I think really my conclusion in that paper is really the no miracles argument is in a way just begging the question, and hasn't really answered the sort of Loudon type doubts. Because, as I've said, what you've got here is, all right, the realist is saying, all right, some theories are successful. The success of some theories is to be explained not by their truth, but by something else. But nonetheless, the theories we know and love around at the moment, their success is to be explained by their truth. Where did that come from? The basic argument does not suffer from this problem at all. See, the trouble, one way I put it in that paper, is the no miracles argument is very much a philosophical argument. It's an argument, as it were, standing above science and looking at science and coming up with this. And that's why a lot of critics don't like it. Arthur Fine, in particular, is very, very persuasive, it seems to me, in his dismissal of this argument, saying, look, what entitles the philosopher to this position above science, making this claim? I'm with Ernan McMullen, who says, look, it's a mistake to run this line, the sort of line that is run in the no miracles argument, of arguing at some level above science, some philosophical level above. Ernan says there's only one level that this should be argued, and it's the level of science. That is the level, and I think he is dead right, and that is the level of the basic argument. So from the perspective of my perspective, and I think Ernan's perspective, the mistake of the no miracles argument is to seek some argument outside science, some philosophical argument to justify science at some philosophical level. The right way to justify realism is at the level of science. Now, the reason, this is a somewhat cynical remark, but I think the reason that the basic argument, the one that Ernan and I like to push, the reason it is unpopular is because it's not at the philosophical level, because we philosophers want a job, we want something to do. And the basic argument simply appeals to science. It says, look at the theory of viruses. Look at how it explains things. That's the best reason we could have for believing in it. Gilmore is another. Gilmore, sorry. Gilmore is an Australian cricketer. I've just got. Gilmore, he argues this too. You just look to science. The argument for believing in viruses is to be found in science, not in some philosophical argument about it. It's the best explanation of observed phenomena. That's the basic argument. There are all these theories positing unobservables, theories about viruses, atoms, electrons, curved space-time, and so on and so forth. All of these theories are positing unobservables to explain observed phenomena. Scientific realism simply generalizes this. Yes, on the whole, we should believe them all because of this. We should believe in the entities they posit because they explain the observed phenomena. So we take all these examples of, as they call it, retail realism, realism about virus theory or atom theory and so on and so forth, and we generalize it into the doctrine of scientific realism. That's all at the level of science.
Right. So I also wanted to ask you how does this allegiance to the basic argument differentiate your scientific realism from other scientific realisms? And I think you partly answered that question, so I'm going to add another one. Is it because it answers the anti-realist challenge, unlike the no miracles argument, which you kind of suggested?
As I say in the ignored argument paper, I think the basic argument is good, and I think the no miracles argument is dubious. Yeah. I don't think I'm quite so rude as to say it's bad, but for the reasons I was trying to indicate a few minutes ago, I think it's dubious. It seems to basically beg the question against a Loudon critic, whereas the basic argument does not. So I think it is a good argument for realism. As I emphasize in that paper, of course, there are lots of famous objections to realism, scientific realism, which need to be addressed. But the objections should be addressed. It's the objections to the basic argument that should be addressed, not the objections to the no miracles argument. These are objections that come from underdetermination and from the pessimistic matter induction and so on. Interesting. And all of those have to be addressed. But it's most important that the argument that needs to be defended is the basic argument, not the no miracles argument.
You concluded your paper, Dammit's Anti-Realism, thusly: better to throw all the semantic planks overboard than to abandon the realist boat. And I want to ask you, is semantics really worth sacrificing in the name of realism?
Well, I suppose what I meant by that is not semantics, but the semantic planks. That is semantic theories. That is, if a semantic theory, any semantic theory, is contrary to realism, yes, it seems to me we ought to abandon that semantic theory. I don't mean we should abandon the practice of theorizing about the meaning of language. Why? Well, it's just back to the sort of naturalistic putting metaphysics first thesis. I think, as I've said before, that we know vastly more about the world of observable objects and unobservable objects than we do about anything to do with semantics or epistemology. We're obviously I'm going with the metaphor of the North boat. The boat we're afloat on, all the best planks are ones that constitute realism, whereas the most dubious parts of the boat, any semantic theory or any epistemological theory. So yes, we should, I think, definitely stick in the spirit, in the Quinean spirit, we should stick to the best planks. Yeah. So I don't think I think the idea of any semantic thesis, of course, it's not hard to come up with ones which are inconsistent with realism. Well, so much the worse for the semantic theory, I would say. Yes.
And somewhat similarly, in the Metaphysics of Truth, you wrote that naturalism is worth dying for. Well, this is a very striking manifest and a strong one, I guess. So, is it really worth dying for? And well, my other question would be, so what if it turned out that there are some phenomena that we cannot naturalize?
Yes, okay, so, well, I do have a bit of a taste for inflated rhetoric, and so that's a bit of inflated rhetoric. But I do have to say I find it hard to imagine ever abandoning naturalism, because at least we're talking here of naturalism as an epistemic doctrine, epistemological doctrine. The alternative, after all, is to adopt some sort of a priori knowledge, and it just seemed to me that the a priori has never been explained adequately and is deeply obscure. And it seems that philosophers appealing to the a priori knowledge to justify their views, it's just like praying. Yeah. I don't think there's any epistemic value to this as a justification. I find it hard to think of anything that should make one think there's any a priori knowledge. There are obviously very big problems in the theory of knowledge. If you're naturalistic about it. Most obviously, how do we know about mathematical truths? How do we know about logical truths? But I think the problem, particularly with mathematics, is more metaphysical than epistemological. What is mathematical reality? That is a very difficult question. I only wish I had an answer, and I don't. And so this is a real gap in my worldview, which I'm not happy with, but I don't know what to say. I think if we had an answer to the metaphysical question, after all, I always think in putting metaphysics first, if we had an answer to the metaphysical question about mathematics, I speculate, that it wouldn't be hard to answer the epistemic question of how it is we know about mathematics.
So you stand by your claim?
Oh, yes. Oh, except it's inflated, right?